"Daddy, look at the picture I drew." I put on my best appraising my son's artwork face and looked down at the picture he had drawn. I recoiled a little when I saw it, not really sure what to make of it. It was a baby head, like a baby doll, but no body was attached to it. The hair was gone, nothing but dots on the scalp, and the eyes were missing and staring openly. A big silver loop like a smile ran through the head, and the bottom was covered with little metal spider legs. I looked at it for a few minutes, wondering what this horrible thing was, but suddenly it came to me, and I felt silly for being so anxious. "Good job, buddy. It's the spider baby from Toy Story, right?" I said, handing it back to him. "No, Daddy, it's the monster that comes to my window at night." I sighed audibly. The monster had become a point of contention in our house as of late. Every night for the past 3 weeks, my son had woken up screaming because there was a monster outside his window. Ever since we had moved into our new house, it had been a regular nightly event, and I had almost started waking up before the screaming started. It never mattered how fast I ran, though. There was never anything there when I arrived. He was always sitting in his bed, pointing out the window and crying about a monster looking in at him. When we got home, he grabbed his tablet and began to watch Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, as he was wont to do after school. I made sure he was comfortable on the couch and not likely to run out the front door as I started washing dishes. Between the three of us, we usually make a fair amount of dishes. I was just finishing up when my wife came home, grimacing at the picture on the fridge as she came in. "That's an interesting piece of artwork," she said, kissing me on the cheek. "Apparently, that's the monster that's been waking him up every night," I said, making her frown as she sat at the table. "Ugh, the monster again. This has to stop. We have to do something." I shrugged, tossing the drying rag into the sink. "I wish I knew what. What if you spent the night in there tonight?" I looked dubiously at her. "What, like on the floor or something?" "No, you could sleep in the other bed in there." I always forget there are 2 beds in my son's room. They were bunk beds, one on the ground level and one on the top. One was supposed to be for guests, playmates, or cousins who wanted to spend the night. The other was for him. In reality, though, it was more of an excuse for my son to pick a bed to sleep in every night. He usually slept on the top bunk, sitting right beneath the window, but sometimes he liked to sleep on the smaller bed at the floor level. "Okay, I guess I'll spend the night in there. Promise you'll reward me in the morning?" I teased. She said she would and giggled when I kissed her on the ear. That reward would never come, though. That night, we went through our nightly routine after dinner. We brushed our teeth, put on our pajamas, and got ready for bed. As I picked up the book and directed him to the loft bed, though, he grabbed my arm and shook his head. I thought he would argue about bedtime. He wasn't a big one for bedtime. Instead, he shook his head and pointed to the bottom bunk. "Can I sleep there?" he asked, pointing at the bunk. I sighed and looked up at the top bunk, wondering how I would get up that tiny little staircase. One look at my son showed me something was seriously going on, though. He looked scared, too scared for a kid his age, and I was kind of scared myself all of a sudden. What was so scary about this bed? This wasn't the first time he'd balked at the idea of sleeping in the loft bed, and I was kind of hesitant to climb into it. I got over that quickly and told him he could sleep on the bottom if he wanted. So we read our Clifford book, I turned out the lights, and swung up into the top bunk as I snuggled down to sleep. For a few hours, I slept fitfully. I was awakened in the dark of the night by a light scratch at the window. It wasn't a loud scraping. It was soft, like something rubbing lightly against the glass as it attempted to get my attention. Maybe a fingernail, maybe a knife tip, but it was consistent in its efforts as it rubbed. After the picture earlier, my mind tried to conjure an image of a baby head with metal spider legs scrabbling at the glass. In my dream, it dug perfect grooves into the window, like a jewel thief's tool in a movie, and it was making progress through the glass. The baby's head had a mouthful of metal teeth to go along with its legs. The teeth gnashed at the glass as the legs cut, and I could do little more than lay there and watch him cut through the transparent barrier. I woke up as he scuttled in, leaping at my face, its twisted metal teeth twinkling. When I woke up, I thought the dream hadn't quite ended. The scraping continued, that soft, whispery sound, and I opened my eyes and glanced at the window. I was covered up, a pillow over my head, and my eyes peeked from beneath the corner of the blanket. I was still half asleep, and as the crust broke away from my eyes, I thought I might still be dreaming. I saw the baby head, metal legs still scrabbling, pressing against the window. I lay still, watching the little creature bounce off the glass. Its scalp was a stubby patch of yanked out hair. Its one blue eye looked straight ahead, placidly, while the other yawned vacantly. The metal legs were bumping and rubbing, making scratching sounds against the glass. They didn't seem as dexterous as they had in my dream. The monster thing seemed like a Halloween decoration, something blown by the wind as it swung from a post. And as I watched it shake and spasm, I noticed the ring from the picture. That thick metal hoop ran through the head and connected it to a thick chain. I followed the chain, and the outline of a person began to come into view. He was framed perfectly against the privacy bushes in front of the window, his clothes blending seamlessly. He was tall, 6 feet at least, and his body was large and looked strong beneath his sweater. His face was doughy and pockmarked as it pressed against the window glass, his tongue wet and forming bubbles as it slid over the filthy glass. His flesh was pressed against the window as he looked into the shadowy room, his eyes searching for something. Thankfully, my son probably never saw him and had only ever seen the strange baby head necklace. If he had seen this strange face pressed against the window, he would have likely never slept in his bed again. The man's eyes found mine suddenly, his crazed look sobering a little as he realized I was not my son. We locked eyes, and I'm ashamed to say I did not deliver some piercing look that scared him away. In my dazed and fearful state, I was just as scared as my son was every night before he started screaming. We stared at each other for a count of 5 before he broke and ran off into the night. The police just left, taking a complete statement and checking the bushes for evidence. My son is asleep in my bed, my wife having wrapped him in her protective arms. I'm sitting on the edge of the bed and setting this to words while it's still fresh. Tomorrow I'm going to the hardware store. I'll be coming back with wood to board up the window. I don't care if this weirdo ever comes back or not. Before I let my son spend another night in that room, I will make sure no one ever peeks through that window. It all started with a trip to the bar. Some friends had invited me out after work for drinks. Given that we all work at the steel mill in this 2-stoplight rural town, that meant we were going to Dusty's. Dusty's is what's colloquially called a dive bar, but it's the only bar we have in town. It's a little roadhouse where you can drink watered-down beer, listen to country music, put some money in the jukebox, play some pool, or hit on the 7 or 8 half-dead barflies that are there every night. If you go to Dusty's for the atmosphere, then you're going to be disappointed. Most of us went there to watch the guys who worked for the town's only other reliable business, the logging company, drink too much and get in fights with people that are unprepared to stand toe-to-toe with them. That night in question was what you would call a slow night. I'd had about 3 pitchers of cheap beer, and the only fight we had seen was when someone's wife came in to drag him away from whatever tart he was talking to by the stage. Neither of them had been particularly skillful brawlers, and when they finally decided to just beat the crap out of her husband and drag him out of the parking lot, I told the guys I was going to turn in early. It was creeping up on midnight, and the bar was deader than usual. Dude, no way you're going to get a cab this late at night. You might as well stick around. Why wouldn't I be able to get a cab? Sandy's runs till 3 in the morning most nights. Charlie, the guy who had told me I wouldn't get a cab, leaned back on his stool so he could look at me. My cousin Dwayne says the cabs won't come out this far after 10 o'clock. They've been having trouble with people going missing. I rolled my eyes, walking my stool back so I didn't fall off of it. I was drunker than I thought I had been, and I didn't want to fall over in front of my friends. Yeah, I've been hearing those stories since I was a kid. Tell your cousin not to believe everything he reads on the internet. I took a staggering step towards the door, catching the bar with my hand as the room spun a little. Nah, Charlie protested. This is pretty recent. They say that the cabs have been arriving to pick up fares, but when they get there, no one is waiting. It's a big mystery, and no one's really sure what to think of it. I scoffed at him, not really in the mood for any of that. I staggered out of Dusty's, taking out my cell phone as I tried to Google the number for Sandy's. I'd used it often enough that you'd think I could remember it, but in my current state, I couldn't remember much of anything. After 2 or 3 failed attempts, I managed to get the number in and got the receptionist after 3 long rings. "Sandy's Cabs, how can I help you?" "Yeah, I need to get a cab from Dusty's bar." I'd heard the clicking of keys on the other end of the phone, but when she learned my location, she seemed to change her mind. "I'm sorry, sir, we don't pick up from Dusty's anymore." I glowered at the phone, not quite sure I had heard her right. What kind of small-town cab company doesn't pick up from the biggest bar in town? "How come?" I asked. "It was deemed too detrimental to our clients." I guess Charlie had been right. "Okay, well, where can I catch a cab?" There was some furious clicking, and when she came back, she almost seemed to be whispering, as if something might hear her. "There's a bus stop down by Richmond. The company has said that it's the closest to Dusty's that will pick up clients." "Richmond? It's almost 5 blocks from here." "Sorry, sir. If you want a cab, then that's where you'll have to go." I considered just going back inside to wait for the others, but decided I was ready to leave. A walk would probably do me some good anyway. "Fine. I'll meet them there in 30 minutes. The dispatcher said that she would dispatch a cab, and then promptly hung up on me. With that out of the way, I began my walk along the shoulder of the rural road. Fortunately, the weather was pretty good for early June. The pine trees on the left side of the road, the side I was walking on, made a skittering sound in the wind, and it sent a chill down my spine. The thick swab of pulpwood trees seemed to stretch on for miles, and the farther I walked, the more it felt like something was watching me. It was little more than a tickle on the side of my face, the slight attention of something that I couldn't really see, but the farther I went, the more the regard rankled me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just feeling creeped out after a long walk in the middle of the night. But I heard the pine needles crunching lightly beneath something, and decided to speed up. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or a fox that I had disturbed up, and it would leave off after it got a sniff of me. They were more afraid of me than I was of them, and once they realized it, they'd take off. The farther I walked, though, the more I thought about the disappearance that Charlie had talked about. I wasn't much for news. I didn't even have a cable subscription, but I was shocked that I hadn't heard anything about these kidnappings or whatever they were. The thought that there might be something watching me from the woods with intentions of making me its next victim made me speed up a little more. I had to stop myself from running as I ate up the road. What would I do when I got to the bus stop if there was no cab there? Would I really be able to just sit in the terminal and wait while whatever was out there kept watching me? I shook the feeling off, feeling silly. It's just a raccoon or a possum or something. Just because it seemed to be going in the same direction I was, didn't necessarily mean it had ill intentions. I tried to ignore the soft sound of indignant pine needles as they broke underfoot, but the farther we went, the harder it became. It was just an animal, I told myself. I had just disturbed it in whatever had brought it out tonight, and now it was curious of me. It would go on its way soon. It would leave me alone if I just ignored it. I kept telling myself that, but the further I went, the harder it was to believe. It seemed to be stalking me from behind the dark forest, a predator intent on man-flesh. It looked like some kind of hunting cat, its head boxy and its body sleek and long. It slunk quietly along behind me, plotting its attack as it prepared to spring. That was stupid, I told myself. There was nothing there. I was just making myself paranoid. I was imagining the sound of large, flat paws on pine falls. I was creating the slightly elevated breathing of the animal. If I turned now, I wouldn't see anything but the shadows and the pine trees. I tried to make my head turn, but my neck seemed unwilling. I remembered something that my grandma had said once when I was a kid, and her voice rustled through my mind like a ghost. Some things don't like being seen, and when you see them, you can't take it back. When I saw the lights of the bus stop, I almost broke into a run. I made myself walk, however, because things like that love to chase, too. As I got closer to the bus stop, I became aware of someone sitting in the lighted shell. As I got closer, I could see it was a woman, her head down and her body abnormally still. I wanted to call out to her to warn her about the thing that was following me, but as I moved closer to the stop, I realized it had broken off its chase at some point. I breathed a sigh of relief, laughing at myself for psyching myself up. It had all been in my head after all, and I had never really been in any danger. As I came into the light of the bus stop, I almost laughed, my smile hard to hide. "Something funny?" asked the woman, lifting her head to look at me. My smile soured a little. Her voice sounded strange in the bus shell, and I worried that I might have offended her. "No, it's just I was worried about something, and it appears to have all been in my head. I was mostly laughing at myself for being foolish." I realized now that I was here that she was sitting with her knees against her face, and she had leaned her head against her knees as she turned to look at me. She was a stringy thing, older teens or early 20s, and her hair looked oily as it hung about her face like filthy drapes in a rundown trailer. She was dressed in something that had once been a sack or maybe curtains, and I wondered if she might be homeless. Worst of all, she had a smell about her, a smell that was not altogether pleasant, a smell that reminded me of my grandfather's smokehouse after hunting season, of the remains of animals left behind that smokehouse. "What was it?" she asked, her teeth looking too big in her mouth as she smiled. I was afraid of being stalked by some kind of hunting cat," I said, surprising myself by speaking at all. "A cat? In this part of the world?" She scooted a little closer to me, a minute movement, but too much for me. This part of the world is more accustomed to bears, I hear," she said. As she scooted this time, I scooted away. Like I said, it was just a feeling. "What kind of feeling?" she asked, scooting again, though I couldn't figure out how. Her arms were around her legs, her knees against her cheek, and she seemed to have no means of scooting at all. It was," I stuttered, my mouth suddenly very dry. "It was like being Red Riding Hood while the wolf stalked her." At that moment, I was as sober as I had ever been. Between the creature and the girl, all the drink had been burned out of me, and I suddenly wondered if the creature might have left because it smelled her. Her smile threatened to cut her cheeks. "I imagine that was exhilarating. Did you enjoy feeling like the prey for once? Did your blood demand that you run, but your mind insisted that walking would be safer? Did you know how much I wanted to chase you?" My heart was pounding, loud enough for me to hear it. She had just admitted to being the one that was stalking me. She couldn't have been the thing in the woods. There was no way. She had been here when I arrived. There was no way she could have dogged my heels through the woods and then gotten here before me. It was impossible. My brain told me these things, but I found it harder and harder to believe as she slowly backed me into the side of the bus shell. I wanted to run, but I knew that was what she wanted too. "You thought you'd be safe once you made it to the light, didn't you, manling? Little did you know that monsters don't always shrivel in the light." She was very close now, her legs coming down as she unfurled herself. She was bigger than I had thought, her body thin and long as she pulled herself onto the bench. She was on all fours, that grin very disconcerting as it came closer. She was feral looking, some wild woman from the depths of a dark jungle. As she prepared to spring, I saw a pair of headlights pin her to the spot as they approached us. I did run then. I ran from the bench and threw myself into the cab, telling the man to drive before the door was even shut. He looked confused, turning back to the girl as if to ask if she needed a ride too, but his confusion didn't last. The color drained from his face as he got a look at her, and he yelled for me to close the door. He pulled off with a squeal of tires, and we both watched the woman as we drove away, her smiling face getting smaller as she watched us. I leaned against the seat, panting as I tried to control my galloping heart. He had to try a couple of times before I could hear him over the blood pounding in my ears, and when I finally made sense of it, we were turning around to get back on the route. "You got very lucky, fella. More lucky than you know." I asked him why I thought so, and he told me a story I'll never forget. "A couple of nights ago, I got a call to that same bus stop to pick up a fare. Dispatch said he sounded weird when he called, like he'd been running, but his car had broke down near the stop, so he figured he had just been pissed off about his luck. I pulled up about 20 minutes later and found not a middle-aged man fuming over his car, but that same girl with the Cheshire Cat grin on her face. She looked up at me as I came to stop, and I just knew that if I got out of my cab, they'd never find me again. The area near Dusty's is supposed to be off limits, and after tonight, I don't think Sandy's will be picking up out here until the situation changes." I've been sitting in my living room, hands shaking as I write this, but unsure of what to do now. I called Charlie before I got into my apartment, but I don't think they really believed me. Charlie was pretty drunk and sounded like he thought I was making fun of him. I hope they make it home safe, but it's that dangerous smile that I can't get out of my mind. She's out there somewhere, waiting for her next victim, and I feel very fortunate to be able to tell you my story and not be a squib in tomorrow's paper. Michelle huffed angrily as she noticed that her dream catcher had fallen off the ceiling again. She checked under the bed, behind the nightstand, even in the bathroom in case it had rolled inside. Nothing. No dream catcher, no sign of where it had gone. It wasn't as if this was uncommon or anything. Michelle had been replacing dream catchers for most of her life, but the older she got, the more annoying it became. Michelle went to the closet and opened a box labeled Decor, sorting through dozens of dream catchers that she had inside. This just happened sometimes. It had happened since she was young, and she'd gotten used to just replacing them. She picked up a frilly pink one, the leather around the ring dyed to match, but put it back. This one had been a gift, and she didn't want to waste it. She settled on a cheap neon blue one from the gas station and attached it to a hook over her bed. She hated to buy more, but the alternative was worse. The alternative was something that she hadn't experienced since she was very young. Michelle's mother had been fiercely spiritual. Trina Jones had stood out like a sore thumb among the community of strict Baptists and Methodists. Her mother had done a little of this and a little of that to get by, and Michelle had a tumultuous childhood. They lived in a little house that had been owned by her grandmother, and Michelle couldn't remember a time when her grandmother had come to the house for longer than a few minutes. She'd asked her why she never came over once, Michelle spending the night while her mother went to a concert with some friends. She and her grandmother had been shelling peas on the porch of Grandma's house, just on the other side of the block, and her grandmother's scowl had been hard to miss at the time. "I hate to see what your mother's done to that house. It offends my senses, but God forgive me, I won't cast her out. She's free to live her life however she likes, but that doesn't mean I have to let her rub it in my face." Her mother had an odd hodgepodge of beliefs, and Michelle could remember all of them jostling together in the living room of their small house. Trina, though her grandmother had always called her Grace, was an old hippie, and she had been taken with paganism and druidic ideas as she followed her friends on the road before Michelle was born. She had also liked the ideas of Buddhism, Taoism, and several other Eastern spiritualities. As such, the living room was often crowded with altars, statues, and other paraphernalia for whatever ritual or rite her mother was working on. The dream catchers were a part of it. Michelle had always suffered from terrible nightmares, and her mother had hung the dream catchers over her bed since she was very young. Her mother had also noticed the rate at which the dream catchers disappeared, but if she knew why, she never said. To Michelle, it was always just a fun mystery that never seemed to have an answer, like where the socks went when you lost them in the dryer. Michelle hung the new dream catcher over her bed and got back to getting ready for work. She had bills to pay and, inevitably, more dream catchers to buy. She found herself thinking back to the mystery of where all the dream catchers went as her workday slowed down. She tried to puzzle out where they might be disappearing to, but ultimately came up with nothing. As a kid, she had tried everything. She had nailed them to the ceiling. She had set up little nets to catch them if they fell. She had gone so far as to set up a little camera one night to see if someone was taking them. But the recordings had stopped at 11 when it ran out of tape. She hadn't really thought about it in a long time, but the more she pondered it, the more curious she became. She made a mental note to set up her phone camera tonight and see if she could find out what was taking them. The phone wouldn't run out of tape, unlike her video camera, and maybe she could figure out what was going on. 4 nights later, and 3 deleted 8-hour recordings later, Michelle woke up to find her phone knocked over and her neon blue dream catcher missing. The video that she scrolled through that day at lunch was less than helpful. The phone had recorded the dream catcher until about 2 a.m., seeing nothing but the dust motes and the circles of feathers on the strings that hung from the ceiling. Then, at 2:07, Michelle heard a soft sound like a latch being slid, and the window had whispered open. A shadow passed over the camera, which was knocked over a few seconds later. No matter how many times she rewound the footage, Michelle couldn't tell what had knocked the camera over. It recorded nothing else but darkness for the rest of the night, until she had picked it up in the morning and turned it off. That gave her something new to worry about. Who was stealing her dream catchers, and why? Surely it couldn't be the same person all these years. She'd been losing dream catchers since she was 3 years old. She had moved 2 states away from her childhood home and moved into 3 different dorm rooms before settling into this apartment. It couldn't be the same person. But then, who was it? As she sat in traffic that day, she felt moved to call her mother, and as she dialed the number, she felt silly. What did she think her mother was going to do about it? Her mother had been a rolling stone ever since Michelle had left home 3 years ago, and the notion that she'd even be reachable was laughable. Trina had been the big push for her to accept the offer from Tennessee State College. She'd set her daughter down, pulling her away from her studies as she tried not to bomb her final and lose her acceptance letter. She told her that she'd been sent a spiritual vision and that it was time for her to travel. This vision didn't have anything to do with her latest man, Beau, and had everything to do with her wanderlust needing to be satiated. I'll stick around long enough for you to graduate, but after that, I'm hitting the road and giving the keys back to your grandmother. Michelle hadn't talked to her much in those 3 years, but she thought she might have some insight in this. She picked up on the 4th ring, and Michelle could hear soft guitar music and the sounds of laughter in the background. "Hey, sweetie, what's the occasion? I haven't heard from you in months." I need to talk to you about something. I'm a little scared, and it's kind of important." Michelle heard the sound quiet as her mother walked away or stepped into someplace. "What's wrong, Micah? You need a reading or some crystal healing? I can send you some vibrations through the phone if you..." But Michelle cut her off before she could get going. If she let Trina get rolling, they'd be on the phone all night. "I need to know about the dream catchers. Why did they go missing?" There was a long pause, and Michelle was worried that she had lost her. "Mom, are you still hanging them?" she asked. And it wasn't the voice she was used to hearing from her mother. It was low and scared, at odds with her mother's usual gregarious nature. "Of course, but I've been thinking a lot about them lately, and I just..." "Don't stop hanging them, Michelle. I know it's a pain, but trust me, they help. But why do I..." "Just..." She paused as she got control of herself again. "Just keep hanging them. If you need more, I'll send you some.
I know a guy out there who makes them, and he owes me a favor. I'll get you some in bulk, but please, just hang them, and stay safe." "Safe from what?" Michelle asked, getting frustrated. Her mother had never been this serious, and it scared her more than the video had. Her mother clearly knew something, but she wouldn't tell her. She had never been good at keeping secrets, and Michelle didn't understand why she wanted to start now. I gotta go. She seemed to gather her thoughts as she tried to find a way to explain. "Just keep hanging them, and stay safe. I love you, Michelle. I'll send you some dream catchers soon so you don't run out." Then she hung up on her, and Michelle was left confused and agitated. She thought about what her mother had told her for the rest of the night. The way she had acted scared Michelle, and the transition from her mother's nickname to her real name had made it all the more jarring. Her mother had started calling her Micah when she was a kid, thinking it sounded more earthy, and Michelle hadn't heard her use her real name in quite a while. She had started to hang a new dream catcher, but paused midway through trying to hook it up there. The more she thought about it, the more she saw no reason to hang a new one. She'd had bad dreams when she was younger, but it was something that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Who's to say that the dream catchers had done anything? She froze there, unsure whether to proceed, and finally, she just tossed the dream catcher onto the nightstand. She'd sleep without it tonight and see what happened. Worst case scenario, she had a bad dream that night and would wake up and put a new one up. It took some time to get to sleep, but Michelle was sure that tonight would be as fine as all the others before it. When she woke up midway through the night, she was glad. The dream she'd been having was terrifying, but it was nothing compared to what she had woken up to. Her dreams had been incredibly dark. She had woken up in a hellscape, the sky constantly burning as the rain came down in runners of flames. She was lying naked on the hard stone, her body pulled close as she shuddered. All around her there were creatures gathering, their growls like thunder. She closed her eyes, trying to wake up, but it just never seemed to happen. She was stuck, waiting for these creatures to come in on her, and as the first lunged at her, its bony mouth snapping, she came awake like a deep sea diver from the depths. She thought for a moment that she was still sleeping, until she felt the pressure in her ear. She had never felt anything so intimate, so violating, and the feeling made her shudder in utter terror. She swiveled her gaze to the left and saw something large and pale crouching beside the bed. It looked like a giant white bug, its body pale and wrinkled. It was hunkered below the side of the bed, like a kid wanting to ask a question. Its bald head gleamed in the moonlight, and Michelle realized that her window was open again. The long red tongue that slid over the edge of the bed and into her ear was as hard to miss as the pale horror kneeling there. The tongue bulged her eardrum, making her head feel far fuller than she was used to. It felt like it might be going all the way to her brain. What was he doing? Was he trying to eat her? What was going on? The tongue slid soupily out of her ear as his piss-yellow eyes grew large. He had noticed that she was awake. As it reached its full height, Michelle realized how big it was. 7 feet tall, each arm tipped with 6 long claws. As it loomed over her, Michelle worried that it would finish what it had started. Its long tongue slid over its thin lips, and they turned up at the corners as it took her in. "Don't worry," it whispered, its voice high and waspish. "I need you alive so I can continue to feed. I must admit, it's nice to get a taste from the source again. I usually get your tasty floating snacks, but today I got a real treat from the old country." Its tongue slid over its lips again, its face a rapture as it remembered the flavor. It climbed out of her window, its body groaning as its bones leaned into the twists, but Michelle felt utterly paralyzed. She didn't understand what was going on. What in the world was that? Had that been what her mother had been trying to protect her from? Had she known about it? Why hadn't she just told her? Michelle pulled her knees to her chest, the terror sending shudders up her frame, and as the birds began to chirp and the sun sent pink fingers over the edge of her window, she finally reached for her phone. Her mother sounded sleepy when she picked up, but it sounded like she might have been expecting the call. "So, you saw it, then?" Michelle couldn't answer right away, managing only a small grunt of acknowledgement. "Did it hurt you? It never did when you were a kid, but you knew it would come after me then?" It wasn't a question. When you were young, you started having night terrors. You would wake me up every night with the most terrible screaming, and I didn't know what to do. Worse than that, you drew pictures of the dreams the next day. Flaming skies, terrible creatures, just the bleakest places imaginable. I didn't know what to do. One night I woke up before you started screaming and felt like I needed to go make sure you were okay. That was when I saw it. He was leaning down over you, his tongue coming out of your ear, and he seemed to be drinking something out of your head. He ran when he saw me, bending out of the window like a serpent, and that only deepened my confusion. That was when I tried the dream catchers. It was on a whim. I didn't know whether it would work, but when it stopped your night terrors, I thought that maybe it kept him away. When they started disappearing, I figured out what was going on." She stopped, collecting her thoughts, and Michelle could hear the sounds of crickets making music in the background. Wherever she was, it was someplace green. Michelle could almost see the trees and feel the breeze, and she suddenly wished that she was with her. Was this why Mom had traveled so much? Was she running from something too? Michelle suddenly realized how little she knew about her mother, and wished that she had taken the time to learn more. The dream catchers don't do anything besides what they're supposed to. They take your dreams and store them inside those strings. Whatever these things are, and I mean things because I don't believe there's just one of them. They like eating your nightmares. The dream catchers distract them, give them something to eat instead. That's why you need to keep hanging them. Michelle wanted to ask more, wanted to know if her mom had any idea about the places she saw in her dreams, but instead, she just reached for the dream catcher on her nightstand. I'll be in touch," Michelle whispered, hanging up as she stood on the bed to attach it to the ceiling. She wouldn't feel safe again until it was back in place. In truth, Michelle wondered if she'd ever feel safe again.
When my parents told me I was going to be sent to take care of my great-grandfather, I was very hesitant. My great-grandfather, Iman Franger, celebrated his 110th birthday in December. Not that anyone had been invited to his party. Actually, there had been no party, because my great-grandfather was a shut-in. He was a famous horror writer, writing and publishing stories since the turn of the century, and he was supposed to have a small fortune saved up. As such, he lived in a Mary Shelley-style house out in the middle of nowhere, toiling away at his latest work of terror. My mother had 5 sisters, and all of them had been trying to get the highly coveted spot in Great-Grandpa's will. But so far, none of my cousins had managed it. It wasn't like I wanted any of his money, but Mom was insistent. She had been after Great-Granddad's money, just like her sisters, since her early adulthood, and now it seemed that her time had finally come around. Since all my other cousins had struck out, this seemed to be her chance. She told me to go and spend the summer, and maybe some of the fall with him, and see how things worked out. Bring some of your writings with you. Maybe that'll get you in good with the old man. And that was how I came to be on my great-grandfather's porch in mid-May, preparing to stay until nearly Halloween. The house was an old 3-story that I knew was nearly a mansion from the few times I'd been there as a kid. There were 8 rooms, 5 bathrooms, a kitchen, a study, and of course, my great-grandfather's office on the 3rd floor. Sometimes you could see him through the large bay window as he sat up there, hard at work at the old typewriter he favored. He had once sat close to the window so that he could look out and perhaps be inspired by the forests or the lawns that surrounded his property. Now, it appeared, he preferred a spot away from such distractions. I rang the doorbell and was unsurprised to hear the lock click open electronically. Great-grandpa kept no staff. Before I'd been born, a few of his caretakers had turned up missing, and after several searches of the home and property, Great-grandpa had finally just dismissed his staff and lived alone. He had mostly relied on the kindness of his relatives, or just done without for most of my life. He was very reclusive, and I wasn't really looking forward to spending the next 6 months in his company. I'd been preparing a manuscript to send off for publication, and I figured that I would have little time for revisions if I was too busy tending to my aging grandsire and his monstrous house. Looking back on it now, I see that I really had no idea what was in store for me. The house had a musty look to it, like some old Gothic construction from one of Great-grandfather's novels. I don't know if this was intentional, but it gave the place a very uncared-for look. I had to wonder what my cousin Leslie had actually done here when he stayed for 8 months last year. The floors were dusty, the drapes in the kitchen were growing a fine crop of mold from a leaky window, and the whole place just had a very dank smell about it. Given the house's age, this was no surprise. The house was well over 100 years old, and had been both my great-grandfather and my grandfather's ancestral home. Now, it was little more than a hulking relic that sat waiting for my great-grandfather to die so some construction company could turn it into a strip mall. A speaker crackled in the foyer, and the buzzing sound made me jump a foot. "Don't just stand around counting the silver. Come up to my study. I have orders for you." Even at 110, it sounded as though he hadn't lost the steel in his voice. So I climbed up the 3 flights of stairs, wondering how my great-grandfather made it up and down these stairs every day. He must come down to eat, I reflected. He hadn't had anyone to help him since Leslie had left 6 months ago. As my young, sturdy legs made the climb up the creaky old boards, I reflected that I was nearly winded as I came to the 2nd floor landing. I would soon become quite intimate with those steps in the months to come, though. My grandfather sat in the topmost room, a room that had once been the attic. The 2nd set of stairs had been built just for him, and they were steeper than the original set by far. As I came up the stairs, I could see my grandfather's desk and the battered old wingback chair he had owned since I was a child. The desk and the chair sat in profile, and it was like a scene from a movie. The camera would start a slow pan in and mount the stairs, and the audience would see the back of the red upholstered chair and hear the clicking of the keys. He sat hunkered there like a gargoyle, arthritic fingers tapping away at the keys of his old battered typewriter. The sound was skeletal somehow, like bones against ivory. He kept right on clocking away as I stood a respectful distance behind his chair, not wanting to get off on the wrong foot with this ancient writer that I must share quarters with for the next few months. The attic room was the size of a normal studio apartment and appeared almost Spartan in its furnishings. There was a bed, small and neat, several sagging old bookcases that looked equally as infected with mold, a rug that stretched from the landing to his dark mahogany desk, which sat ever facing into the corner. He had once faced it towards the large picturesque window that looked over his property, but now it looked only into the corner, as though someone had put my ancient grandsire in time out. "I understand that you are to be my new caretaker." I jumped a little, the clicking leading me to believe that he would go right on ignoring me for a little while longer. His voice was creaky, raspy from lack of use. I expected to see dust puff out from behind the chair, and when he turned, I decided that my expectations hadn't been far off. To call my great-grandfather ancient would have missed the mark. The man was shrunken to the point of elvishness. He could not have been more than 4 feet tall, and his arms and legs looked shrunken and childlike. His arms were held out in front of him, hands held down at the wrists in a way that made me wonder how much it must hurt him to ride on. His legs hung an inch above the floor as he sat in that monstrous chair, and I remember thinking that he looked like a child sitting in his father's seat. The image was more grotesque than humorous, however. "You should know that I have high expectations for my helpers. I give no special treatment for family members. Your life here will be hard, but focus on the silver lining. You might just manage to acquire that oh-so-coveted spot in my will that my children and my children's children and now my children's children's children seem so incapable of garnering. Anything is possible, I suppose." And when he shrugged his shoulders, I imagined that I could hear them grind together. Listening to him talk was like watching a particularly talented bit of ventriloquism. His accent was plummy, cultured, and far too deep for the child-sized creature residing in that throne. I expected someone to poke their head out from the back of the chair any minute now, and laugh, saying how they had gotten me. When we both ended up staring at each other for the next few seconds, and no grand revelation was revealed, he went on. He told me about his meal schedule first. He ate breakfast at 5, lunch at 11, and dinner at 6. He subsided almost entirely on Campbell's soup, of which he had a large supply in the pantry. There were 7 different flavors of soup, one for each day of the week, and every month there was a number I would call to have more delivered. He told me that I could make a list of food I wanted as well, and that they would be delivering it to the house with the order. "Just keep the bill under $500 a month," he droned. "I would like to remain in funds until I die." He bathed every night at 7. While he assured me that he didn't need help bathing, he would need help getting to the bathroom, into the tub, out of the tub, and back to his room. I was to put him in the tub and then leave until summoned again. He would be fully dressed again, and when I arrived, I would help him back to his room. His schedule, other than that, seemed to be writing. He wrote sometimes for 18 or 19 hours a day, and would often write well into the night if the mood took him. He rarely slept, he told me, and I would likely find him napping in his chair if I needed something early in the morning. He slept most often between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. I was not to disturb him or make any noise between those hours whatsoever. "When you're my age, you find you just don't need to sleep as much as normal people. But I won't have the little that I do get disturbed by your needless clatter." My duties, other than feeding and bath time, were my own. I would like the house swept once a week, the windows opened once a week to air out the dust, the drapes taken down and washed once a month. I have a sneaking suspicion that feckless cousin of yours didn't accomplish any of these things, so it's likely a mess down there. I do not own a TV, nor do I have internet. There is a phone in the kitchen that you may use if you should need to, and while I do have electricity, I expect you to turn the lights off behind yourself. I seem to recall that your cousin Winifred racked up a $400 power bill while staying here, and I ejected her for it. So long as you follow my rules and keep the house, I suspect I will ignore you for your stay here, and you will have no hardships. He dismissed me after that, and thus began my time in my great-grandfather's house, a time I would come, in later years, to regret undertaking. It first began with the typing. My grandsire hadn't lied. He wrote 18 or 19 hours a day, and the keys of his typewriter were loud. You could hear him typing away from anywhere in the house, and the noise became a constant background drone. Using my hotspot on my phone, I was able to get some writing done, and my proofreading was coming along very well. It was slow, and the signal out here was poor at best, but I plucked away at it as dutiful as I could, despite the distracting sound of all that clacking. The sound almost seemed to scuttle, worming its way into your ears like phantom fingers as you sat trying to concentrate. I tried playing music, I tried using earbuds, but no matter how high the volume, the sound seemed to clatter against my senses like a badly played piano. I began to become rather sympathetic for a certain Poe character, having my own telltale heart clattering at all hours of the night. On sunny days, I would even take my laptop out onto the lawn and get some work done. Though it defied all logic, I imagined that I could hear that typewriter, even on the porch, or on the way to the mailbox down the lane, easily a half-mile from the house. I know how it sounds, but I also know what I heard, and it invaded not just my waking hours, but my resting hours as well. That's also how the dreams started. Sometimes I would dream that it was me sitting in that big old chair, typing away for hours on end as the words just came sliding up the paper. In my dream, the paper was never ending. It simply rolled on and on as it came out of the typewriter. The words rose like a tree in the forest before my very eyes. My fingers would clack endlessly on the keyboard, my young, strong digits becoming withered like great-grandfathers as I typed my life away. I was always in front of that big bay window as I worked, watching the fireflies out in the woods as they frolicked. Sometimes, though, I would catch a glimpse of myself in the mirrored glass and jolt awake as my great-grandfather's face looked back at me. Then there was the whispering. The whispering had likely been there from the start, but I didn't pick up on it for several weeks. Great-grandpa didn't own a vacuum, so I was stuck sweeping the floors and taking the drapes outside to beat them with a broom. Fortunately for me, carpets were not all the rage at the turn of the century, and Great-grandpa had hardwood floors throughout. I was sweeping the second floor when I heard a spidery whisper coming from the stairs at the end of the hallway. It was nearly unintelligible, the voice the thinnest of whispers, but my great-grandfather was unable to match it in his response. "I won't. You can't make me. You don't even know if he could take my place. It doesn't matter. I won't curse him with the same life I've been cursed with. Stop whispering in my ear and let me finish." Then came the loud crash of keys resumed, and Grandpa ignored whoever had been whispering to him. I thought about it as I swept, unsure what to make of it. Who had he been talking to? More importantly, who had he been talking about? I knew that he had no phone up there. If he needed something, he always called down the stairs, and the whispering had sounded like it was coming from right inside the room as opposed to a phone. I shook it off as the senile ramblings of the old and troubled man and went about my chores, wanting to get them done so I could return to my own work. That was the first time, but it wouldn't be the last time I heard those whispers. I began to hear them in more than just Grandpa's study as well. They began as something like the scrabbling of mouse feet, a skittery noise that scrabbled across my senses sometimes. The longer I listened, the more I heard, and what I heard was frightening. They whispered about far-off places and foreign hellscapes. They whispered about terrible devils and ancient evils, all of which would win in the end, despite the hero's best efforts. I heard them sometimes in my sleep, a place I could not escape them, and they often filled my dreams with terrible prophecy. The work was literally the third indication that something was amiss. While Grandpa's genre had always been horror, I was more interested in fantasy and YA. My current manuscript was a puff piece, something to get my name on the desk of an agent or a publisher so I could work on more groundbreaking fantasy. My story was good, warring vampire clans and a romance that was trying to blossom amidst the chaos, but it was nothing new. It was a safe bit of YA pseudo-fantasy, the kind that had a built-in audience and was fairly safe. The longer I worked on it inside Grandpa's house, though, the darker the story began to become. Characters began to die more often, backstories became less teen-friendly, and a shadow fell across what had been a fairly light little book up until that point. A lot of my time seemed to be spent fixing changes I had made the day before, and I was getting frustrated with the shifts in tone that seemed to be trying to take place in my story. It was as though someone was also whispering in my ear, telling me to spill blood or inject horror where none was needed. I found my mind wanting to write things that I'd never been interested in before, and the feeling made me uneasy. Then, one morning, I woke up to find my great-grandfather reading some of my editions from the other side of the table. I had fallen asleep at the keys, and when I woke up, I saw his spindly arms scrolling down as he read. It was clear he didn't like using the computer. He made a face every time he had to touch the keyboard, as if putting his fingers on it was something unpleasant. And when he saw me noticing him, he turned the computer back towards me. Then, he did something I'd never seen him do in all the years I'd known him. He smiled. "You write well, boy. It's a little fluffy for my taste, but it appears that I'm not your target audience. How long have you been writing it?" I told him I'd been writing my current work for about a year, but I'd been writing in general for most of my life. He nodded, seeming to like the taste of this new information. "Thought I was the only one, at least since your Uncle Stephen passed." Then, he slid out of the chair, his feet barely making a sound as they touched the floor, and ambled back upstairs. After that, I seemed to notice him hovering around the dining room often as I made corrections and changes to my manuscript. At first I tried to ignore him, not wanting to make it awkward, but as the weeks tripped by, I asked if he'd like to come help me with my revisions. He declined at first, saying he needed to get back to work. But over time, he actually came to sit with me and helped me labor through the 500 pages of tween trash, as he often called it. Every new revision, the darker ones at least, seemed to interest him, and I found myself taking his suggestions more than I rejected them. Then, one day around Halloween, he invited me to his study. He said there was something he needed to show me. He was standing by the gigantic wingback chair when I arrived. He looked even more like an underfed child as he slid a hand over the arm, his head only slightly taller than the arm of the chair itself. "You've impressed me, son. Your writing is a little rough, but I suppose that all writing looks rough after a century of it. Many people have asked me how I've lived so long, and writing is the secret to my success. The writing, however, is only half of it. The other half is this." He stroked the chair again as he said it, a look between loathing and loving crossing his face. "Your chair?" I asked skeptically. "Not my chair. This chair was never mine. It was loaned to me on the grounds that I use it for its intended purpose." "And what purpose is that?" I asked, feeling the hair on the back of my neck prickle. "Terror," he answered. I almost expected to hear thunder rumble outside as he made this exclamation. "The chair is meant to spread terror?" I said, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. Great-grandpa didn't seem to notice. He just kept looking at the chair in that loathsomely fascinating way he had. The chair seemed to have him under its sway, and he was powerless to cleave from it. "The chair is a conduit. Its purpose is simple, to spread fear and to propagate terror. You've heard the whispers by now, I'm sure." I nodded, hearing them scurry across me even now as I watched my grandfather stroke the old chair that suddenly seemed to be shallowly respirating before my eyes. "From the second I read the changes to your manuscript, I knew it had gotten in your head. It calls to you, just as it called to me, and now it wants to make a deal." I took a step back from the chair. "What are you talking about? A deal? What sort of deal?" "You can write forever. Write as much as you want, and your work will make you the kind of money that puts normal men to shame. All you must do is sit in this chair and let it work through you. You can do that, can't you?" I wanted to refuse him, this grinning skeleton in his slowly, but now visibly respirating chair. The longer I looked at it, the more I could see the baleful eyes, the fanning nostrils that were almost snake-like, the grinning mouth that sat in the seat. It looked at me, and as much as I wanted to deny what he was saying as the ramblings of a crazy old man, I couldn't. The chair's glamour had slipped away, and now I could see the monster that lay beneath. "Come sit," he beckoned. "Come sit and let it show you its power." I didn't want to. Sitting on that thing was the last thing I wanted to do, but I found my legs had other ideas. I had moved as if by magic, my legs that of a puppet's on strings. I expressed all my will, but I was a child resisting a hurricane. Great-grandfather moved aside as I came before his throne, and when my bottom slid into that hoary old thing, I expected the teeth to gobble me up. Instead, I was filled with something unexpected. I was filled with completion, a sense of homecoming. I was complete. I saw myself reach for the typewriter, as I had done in my dreams. The whispering beckoned me to write, compelling me to spill my talent for it, and I obliged. The words rolled from me. They weren't mine, not mine at all, but they oozed from my fingers like blood. My words became the click-clacking of the keys. My mind was a chalkboard fit only to be wiped and filled again and again. I was taken over, possessed, and the demon of inspiration capered through me. There was no endless paper now, but I saw the sheets filled and refilled again and again, made full only to be exchanged by another, and as I looked down at the ivory keys, I felt my sanity reassert itself as I saw the stains on that virgin ivory. They were dark, old blood, but they would surely be wetted again. I don't remember passing out, but I remember waking up. I was lying on the bed in my great-grandfather's study. He was sitting on the edge of it, looking even more childlike as his legs dangled. It occurred to me how infrequently I saw him away from his keyboard in all the months I'd been here, and he looked both forlorn and greatly relieved as he watched his withered feet swing. "You did quite well. The first 300 pages of a manuscript that will soon grace the New York Times bestseller list, I'm certain. At least, my agent seems to think so.
I never have much of a head for popular fiction." "What?" But I realized I didn't know what to ask. "It kicks like a mule, don't it, son? I remember the first time I experienced it, back in 36, or was it 26? Who can remember? I was edging towards middle age then, kids out of the house and off on their own, and your great-grandmother had just died of a sudden pneumonia. I was alone in this mausoleum, sure that I had maybe one book in me, but unsure of how to coax it out. The man I bought the chair from showed up out of nowhere, showed up as if I had summoned him, and said he had just what I was looking for. Then he showed me this ghastly hulk you see crouching over there, and I was highly skeptical. My eyebrows slid up even more when he said that it had already been paid for." He got a dreamy look on his face, as though his mind was casting back through time. "He told me that all I had to do was write, just right, and the chair would do the rest. He told me that the chair would take my writing into heights that no one had ever dared hope, and all I had to do was shake his hand. When I sat down to begin, the man tipped his hat and grinned like an imp. I never looked back. At first, it was thrilling, churning out stories, books, whole series over the course of years. I was detailing my legacy at a breakneck speed. I was like a dragon, looking up to see decades pass by as I sat before my window." His dreamy look became melancholy then, his toes flapping bonelessly as his legs rose and fell like lunatic jackstraws. "This is my legacy, boy. This is the inheritance that all my children and all my grandchildren and all my great-grandchildren have struggled for. The money, the house, the land, none of it matters. My inheritance is that chair and that typewriter and a legacy of stunning horror. It is a mantle, and if you chose not to take it up, I would understand. But, and I know from experience, if you don't take it up, you'll drive yourself crazy thinking about what could have been. You'll wonder if the success you have couldn't have been greater, if the joy you felt could not have been more, and if your years upon the earth could not have been better spent." He looked at me then with such naked hope that I realized what it would mean if I took this burden from him. He would die, but it seemed he was ready to die. His legacy would be mine. The paper would say that the talent ran in the family, and it would continue to run until I passed it on or fell to dust. In the end, I can't even say that I did what I did to save my great-grandfather from his continued suffering. In the end, I did it because he was right. If I didn't do it, I would always wonder what if. He extended his hand to me. "The papers are signed and sitting on my desk. The house, the land, it's all yours. Everything. And everything that comes with it," he emphasized. I'm proud to say that my hand didn't shake as I took his. On the third pump of his arm, my great-grandfather turned to dust, and I was left to sit and watch him scatter across the place he loved so much. Then I took my place in the mouth of that great beast and began to write. I would continue to do so for a very long time. It's been so long since I watched my grandsire dissolve before my eyes. In that time, I've been the most prolific horror writer of my age. I've built up money like some old dragon, sitting on my wealth as I hunker on my hill. Sometimes my relatives come to see me, but most times they don't. My own mother refused to talk to me after great-grandfather left everything to me in his will, but I hardly noticed. She died a few years ago, or was it a few decades? I didn't attend the funeral. Being away from my work for too long makes the whispers less quiet. I travel some, as my grandfather must have done in the beginning, but I never stay away for long. The stories must be told, the conduit must be maintained, and I must remain the keeper of this black lighthouse. It takes a toll, though, to be certain. I understand why my great-grandfather slept so little. If I cannot continue to expel this darkness, it pools inside me, and the vivid nightmares often bring me screaming back to reality. The bags under my eyes have become luggage,
and yesterday I glanced up into the window and thought I'd seen a ghost. The old man that looked out from it was withered and sunken, and I thought that Great-Grandpa's ghost had returned to torment me. I see now why Great-Grandfather moved into the corner after a time. I'm not entirely alone, though. My cousins have gone on to have children of their own, and sometimes they send them to me, as I was once sent. One of them, a girl named Katie, is on her way now. I've heard that Katie is a rather prolific poet, and said to be quite talented. We shall see what the chair makes of her. Who knows? Perhaps I might be allowed to stop too before long, and bask in the comfortable blackness that awaits me as well. She was the perfect woman. I have no idea how I managed to catch her attention. Our relationship, our marriage, it was all perfect, except for one thing that neither of us could have foreseen. We met in college. She was working towards her English degree, and I was studying business. My major required me to take an English course, as did hers, and when she asked if the desk next to mine was taken, I was almost too stunned to answer. Kathy was beautiful in that artless way that some women have, and she smiled as I fumbled over my answer. That would have been the end of it for most people. I had fumbled my one chance, but Kathy wasn't like other women. She told me later that she had found it endearing, and she suspected that she was already a little bit taken with me when she sat down. When I saw you from across the room, I just knew that I wanted to get to know you better. We talked a little bit before class, comparing schedules and going over the usual getting-to-know-you chit-chat. When the teacher arrived and class began, I found myself snatching little glances at her as she bent over her notebook. She caught me looking once, and to my surprise, I saw her smile at me. I was smitten after that smile, and when Kathy invited me to have lunch with her after class, I didn't even have to think about it. We were dating a week later, and as we got closer, should have noticed the warning signs of problems to come. I suppose I understand how it escaped my notice, though. Few people would have considered utter peace and pure relaxation a problem. When we walked hand in hand, I would get this feeling of utter peace throughout my body. When we kissed, I felt like nothing in the world could hurt me. She made me feel safe, made my problems melt away, and I knew I wanted more than the few hours a day we got to share with each other. Her college schedule made it difficult to go out more than twice a week, and my own class load kept me busy too. Part of the reason we had such little time together, though, was Kathy's commute to and from school. Kathy lived an hour and a half from campus, and couldn't begin to afford an apartment on her meager student income. The job I worked, plus the leftover grant money I had, paid the rent on my studio apartment, but not much else. Another person paying rent was nice, but I couldn't say that was the only reason that I offered to let her live with me. I also wanted her close to me. She made me feel good, made me feel safe. Being in her presence made the dark world in which I lived more tolerable, and I wanted that for more than a few hours a week. I offered to let her move in, and after a week of mulling it over, she agreed. That weekend, we combined our meager possessions, and I slept like a baby in her arms that night. As we began to spend our evenings together, the problems became more apparent. Problems is a terrible word for it, because in the beginning, it was more like a godsend. When we sat on the couch, our hands linked, I would find myself getting drowsy. When we would cuddle on the couch, our bodies pressed together, I would lose minutes at a time, and my eyes would grow heavier and heavier. The feeling of peace I found in her presence put me at ease, and that ease led to some of the best sleep of my life. I would sleep more deeply than I ever had before, and wake up after 8 hours refreshed and ready to start my day. Kathy seemed pleased with the attention. She'd only been with one other person before we started dating, but I could tell that she wondered why I hadn't slept with her yet. Some women's feelings would have been hurt by this, but Kathy had been raised in a very religious household, and must have assumed that I was simply waiting till marriage. The truth was that, while I would have loved to have slept with her, the sleeping was the problem. Whenever we got close, my arms around her and our bodies pressed together, I would find myself blinking and suddenly losing long periods of time. Sometimes she would lead me to bed, sometimes she would just sleep with me on the couch, but I would always wake up next to Kathy with a deep feeling of fulfillment. I had assumed that she was feeling the same way. I often thought that maybe this was the feeling that we gave each other, and it made me feel good to bring her the same sort of peace that she brought me. This went on for about 6 months, and I thought that things were going well. We went out to dinner, we had friends over, we went on dates, and seemed to be living together with few problems. I had been tentatively looking at rings, preparing to pop the question and make it official. Besides the matter of intercourse, I thought we were happy. Then one evening I came home from class to find her crying on the couch. I hadn't seen her that day. She'd been absent from the one class we had together, and when I'd called her, she said she was feeling sick. It was nothing serious, she maybe had a cold or something. I'd told her to feel better, hanging up so that I could get to my next class. But as I saw her looking up from her cupped hands, I knew something was definitely wrong. I had never seen her cry before, and it was so alarming that I could do little else but go to her and wrap my arms around her. She wouldn't tell me what was wrong, but I wish now that I had pressed her. I wrapped her in my reassuring arms and tried my best to comfort her in her time of need. My reassuring arms quickly turned into drawing her close and wiping her tears away. This soon led to kissing, which led to touching, and then to the bedroom. I won't bore you with the details, but I think you know how it ended up. I woke up the next day, her hands lightly stroking my hair, and fresh tears running down her cheeks. It was our first time, and I couldn't even remember how it had gone. When I asked her to marry me a month later, she seemed overjoyed. We had been living together for half a year now, and our love for one another was pretty clear. She wore my engagement ring with pride, showing it off to her friends, and we began to plan our wedding. I was too blind to see that she was making appointments with a campus therapist more often than she used to. I was too comfortable to notice the tears that sometimes came to her while we lay in bed together. I was too wrapped up in my own feelings to notice the prescriptions that appeared in the medicine cabinet. I was just so comfortable that I never wanted it to end. It's easy to get tunnel vision when you're spending all your time in the tunnel of love, I suppose. After that first time, however, I did make efforts to be better in the bedroom. Kathy was patient with me, seeing that I was trying, but I often found myself trying one moment and waking up the next. She was always quick to reassure me that it was nothing to be ashamed about, but I knew it hurt her deeply to have a partner incapable of being intimate with her. So, I set out to find the reason for my sleeping fits. And so, I began to make doctor's appointments of my own. I said that the appointments were for her benefit, but I was honestly more concerned that I might have a real problem brewing. The last thing I wanted to discover at 22 was that I was a narcoleptic or had a problem with my brain or something. I explained what was happening to my doctor, and he was helpful, if not a little over-jovial. Kids your age shouldn't be having any sort of problems in that department, but we'll get you checked out, he assured me, with a smile and a pat on the shoulder. I was tested for every sleep disorder imaginable. I was given prescriptions of my own, but none of them seemed to work. I took supplements, signed up for new drugs that had just hit the market, and joined medical test groups. Despite all this, though, no one seemed to have any answer for what was going on. I was just so comfortable with my fiancée that I couldn't help but fall asleep in her arms. It would have been sweet if it wasn't worrying me to no end. We had decided on March for our wedding, the first anniversary of our meeting, and I was determined to make it special for her. I was as helpful and dutiful as a boyfriend/fiancé could be. I went with her to every stage of the planning. I picked out cake toppers, helped with seating charts, picked out menus, visited and put down a deposit on the venue, and comforted my soon-to-be wife every step of the way. The saving grace, of course, was that I could put my performance issues down as pre-wedding jitters as the day crept closer and closer. The wedding was easily the happiest day of my life. I stood at the altar, sweating in my rented tux, waiting for the moment she would arrive. The crowd huddled behind me in a murmuring throng of excited tension, and it felt like 1,000 years had passed before the music began from the organist. When I saw her in her dress, gliding down the aisle like a dream, I fell in love all over again. She was beautiful, her tears now ones of joy, and I never regretted asking her to join her life to mine. We exchanged rings, spoke vows of eternal love, and then walked from the church as husband and wife. As we stood for pictures, the venue having set up on the lawn to host our reception, I made ready to fulfill my end of tonight. I drank champagne for toasts and black coffee by the cup. I took caffeine supplements before we climbed into the car and left for our honeymoon suite. As she went into the bathroom to take her dress off, I walked around and tried my best to keep my heart racing. I told myself over and over again that tonight would be different, that tonight would repay for all the rest. I wanted nothing but to make her feel special and to make tonight one to remember. When she came out of the bathroom, the two of us standing before each other as husband and wife, I felt like I was possessed with all the energy and serenity I would ever need. When we woke up the next morning, intertwined as we always were, there were no tears on her cheek. Only a look of fulfillment I knew all too well. We settled into married life easily, and it was as though nothing had changed. Despite my best efforts, however, I couldn't recapture the magic of that night. Whenever I was in her arms, whenever we were close, I couldn't help but fall into that feeling of utter serenity and slip off to sleep. It was as if those feelings had multiplied after the wedding. She made me feel like I could die of happiness. I couldn't hold her hand as we drove anymore, lest I find myself listing off the road. If I cuddled on the couch with her to watch a movie, I would inevitably miss over half of it. I loved nothing more than to bask in that feeling of serenity that seemed to waft around her, but I also felt guilty as she seemed to return to her silent, tearful nature. I couldn't help myself. I was powerless to resist the pull of her, and I was powerless to do anything when I was in her arms. I began to notice as her mental health got worse, though. Kathy was moody and manic by turns. Sometimes she wanted nothing to do with me, only to cry and demand my attention. I often missed classes because I was afraid to leave her by herself, and I finally insisted that we go see a doctor. The doctor said this was normal. Her medication just needed to be adjusted. Despite their best efforts, though, the new pills and the adjustment of the old pills seemed to do no good. Our lovemaking was non-existent, despite my best efforts. I tried to comfort her, tried other means of intimacy, attended couples therapy with her, tried my best to keep her from imploding. In the end, though, it did no good. I remember the night it happened as vividly as I remember our wedding day. I was lying in bed, Kathy still in the bathroom, and I was worried about the appointment we had the next day. They planned to try her on a new battery of medications, and Kathy seemed to be willing to give it a try. She had wandered around the house like a fretful ghost all day, and I'd been keeping an eye on her until this very moment. I felt like if we could just get to bed, if we could just fall asleep in the comfortable embrace of each other's arms, everything would be fine. She climbed into bed, and something about her face didn't seem right to me. Then she opened her arms, and I was like a meteorite hurling into a planet's gravity. "I love you," she said, kissing my forehead as her heart raced against my chest. "I'll always love you." I fell asleep, wrapped in the arms of my love, sure that as long as I remained here, everything would be okay. I woke up, however, to discover that I was sleeping next to a corpse. I called the paramedics, but there was nothing they could do. She'd been dead for hours as I slept. Kathy had taken an overdose of sleeping pills before tucking in for the night. It was almost ironic in the end, and the note she had left on the nightstand told me everything I needed to know. All these years, I had believed that I was giving her the same feeling that she was giving me. It turned out I was nothing but a thief in the night. Kathy said that her mental decline had started almost the day we met. The balance and fulfillment that I had been expecting was a mirror to the anxiety that she was feeling. She had taken my inability to stay awake as something she was doing. She was boring me. I was disinterested. She was failing as a woman as a result. The longer it lasted, the more she felt like she was the cause. She wanted to please me, to be a good wife, but the longer it went on, the more inadequate she felt. She loved me. She never wavered in her love for me. But being with someone who was physically uninterested in her was killing her, physically and emotionally. She had finally decided that if sleeping next to her was what I wanted, then she would give me what I wanted. We would both sleep soundly for a change. I'm writing this as I sit in the viewing room of the funeral parlor. They gave me an hour before her cremation, a final viewing for her grieving husband. I could tell by the way they keep looking at me that I must look terrible. I've been awake for the past 5 days, and the bags under my eyes look more like suitcases. I've become accustomed to her presence, to the way she makes me feel, and now my sleep is all but non-existent. I'm like a junkie with no smack, and my fix lies in that box across the way. looking as lovely as the day we met. I think that when I get done with this, I may climb into that simple pine box with her and see if I can find some sleep. I can almost feel whatever she possesses from my seat here, and I want to see if she still possesses it, even in death. Who knows? Maybe I'll pull the lid closed behind me, and they'll simply slide me into the chute as well. It seems fitting somehow that the two of us should sleep forever, two souls at rest for all time.